So as we're moving into August, we will complete the series on the book of Judges at the end of August, but we're going to spend 3 weeks on this guy named Samson. So we're going to be in Judges chapter 13 today, and Samson has different things that people might know about him. One of the more common things is his strength. People know Samson as a strong individual. But I think Samson represents us in many different ways because his strength was on the outside. He had physical strength where he could lift heavy objects and that type of stuff. But inside, he was pretty weak. So his outside shell looked strong, but he was weak on the inside, particularly politically and spiritually and relationally. Samson was a pretty weak individual. And he was, in a lot of ways, he was a pretty rogue individual. He broke every vow he made, every promise he made, and he is the last judge that we find in the book of Judges. Now Samuel, in the book of 1st and 2nd Samuel, who anoints Saul and then David as kings of Israel, is noted to be the last judge, but Samson's the last judge in the book of Judges, and he stands in contrast to Othniel, who was the first judge back in chapter 3. Othniel was upright, did everything as he was supposed to do, led in ways that honored God, faithfully followed God in everything he did, and Samson was about the complete opposite. He kind of marched to his own drum. He did things his own way, did things contrary to God. And one of the things that really sets Samson apart from the other judges is that he only began the deliverance. See, there was oppression, and the normal cycle in the book of Judges is that the people of Israel would sin, and then they'd be handed over to their enemies. They'd be oppressed, and then they would cry out to God, and God would raise up a deliverer or a judge and would save Israel from the hands of their enemies. Well, Samson did not complete the cycle. He only began the process of deliverance. He did things that didn't necessarily honor God in many different ways. Every part of his life seems to do things that just weren't exactly right. See, Othniel unified Israel and brought peace. Samson had short leadership. He had no unity and did not bring peace. His story in many ways is extremely tragic. But another thing that separates Samson's story from most of the other stories in the book of Judges is there's not a time where the people of Israel cry out to the Lord for deliverance. There's no cry for, hey, God, save us. They're just oppressed. They are controlled by the Philistines. Samson is not faithful or obedient, and he uses his skills, his abilities, for his own personal ambitions. And he seems to just distort God's calling in his life for his own gain, his own abilities. He's a trickster. He's selfish. He represents God's people, represents Israel in their sinful ways. But one of the things Samson also does is he alludes to the coming hope in the Messiah. He's an imperfect individual. The Messiah is not imperfect. Samson is imperfect. But he sacrifices himself for his people. He is willing to take on the responsibility for his people. And so we see that there's a bit of an allusion towards the Messiah from Samson. But he was unpredictable. He was unstable. He was undependable. And in many ways, Samson's life was devoted to fulfilling personal vendettas. Now, one of the things as I'm thinking about Samson that comes to mind is who God is. And I come to the conclusion that God is meticulously spontaneous, not to be confused with unpredictably chaotic. God is not one of those, he's not up there saying, oh, we'll do this over here, or maybe something over there, or trying to figure things out on the fly. God has a very particular plan. He is meticulous about it. But it's not as though it's formulaic. God is spontaneous in ways that will surprise us. And I think what happens sometimes is that God has a plan in place, but we as people say, no, we're going to do something else. And so God changes plans. He says, you know what? You're not going to do this, but I know how to accomplish my will. So we can either participate in the plan that God has, or God says, well, I'm still going to accomplish my purpose. And we see that's what happens with Samson. And so I say God is meticulously spontaneous. In some ways that contradicts itself. But what I mean by that is there are times God surprises us. That God just makes us go, whoa. And I think it's important for us to take a step back and recognize that. Because I'm an individual who enjoys a plan. I enjoy having structure. But I do recognize there are times in my life where I have to pull back on that a little bit. Funerals are one of those times that I try to make sure I do that. I have, and it's weird to talk about funerals sometimes, I guess, but I have a very particular plan with the funeral. We have everything lined out. I use a manuscript. I'm very structured in that. But one of the things I tell the family, I say, if you have a last-minute change, we'll make it happen. Because I'd rather fumble and mumble a little bit and not be as smooth and make sure we honor the loved one that has passed. See, that's not how God is, though. God has a plan, and he's not going to fumble and mumble if something changes. He's not going to have to adjust. He's got a plan in place. And so you can look at your life and say, my life is a mess, or my life is not going the way I want it, or how do I get to this point? God's got it. Now, we can act like Samson and do our own thing, or we can join God in the plan that he has for us. But we start Samson's story in Judges chapter 13, verse 1, where it says, in those days, a man named Manoah from the tribe of Dan lived in the town of Zorah. His wife was unable to become pregnant, and they had no children. Now, one of the things we have learned is that Israel has been oppressed by the Philistines for 40 years. That's a long, long time. Now, 40 years is a Hebrew idiom for a generation. So for an entire generation, they were oppressed by the Philistines. And what happened is that they did evil in the Lord's eyes. And part of the implication here is, well, they didn't necessarily think it was evil in their own eyes. And that's part of the problem with Judges. Because if we do things what is right in our own eyes, we can justify actions that do not honor God. And so the people of Israel are doing things that are right in their own eyes. They are not doing things that are right in God's eyes. And they're not crying out to God. So Samson eventually takes the place of Israel as the one to cry out to God, to ask God for deliverance. But throughout the story of Samson, one of the things we kind of almost understand is that Israel seems to be content with being oppressed by the Philistines. For 40 years, they lived this way. They got used to it. Well, it's not ideal, but what are you going to do? They were used to being ruled by those who weren't God. But we have this story of Manoah and his wife, and they have no children. And there are many stories like this in the Old Testament, particularly Abraham and Sarah and Genesis. And then we have Hannah in 1 Samuel. And we see all of these. When we have stories like this, the reader is getting some context clues. Say, God is up to something. God is getting ready to do something. And we find in verse 3 that the angel of the Lord appeared to Manoah's wife and said, even though you have been unable to have children, you will soon become pregnant and give birth to a son. So be careful, you must not drink wine or any other alcoholic drink, nor eat any forbidden food. You will become pregnant and give birth to a son, and his hair must never be cut, for he will be dedicated to God as a Nazirite from birth. He will begin to rescue Israel from the Philistines. The woman ran and told her husband, a man of God appeared to me. He looked like one of God's angels, terrifying to see. I didn't ask where he was from, and he didn't tell me his name. But he told me, you will become pregnant and give birth to a son. You must not drink wine or any other alcoholic drink, nor eat any forbidden fruit. For your son will be dedicated to God as a Nazirite from the moment of his birth until the day of his death." So we find that the angel visits Manoah's wife. Now remember the book of Judges, the way that women are treated and viewed shows the spiritual health of Israel. That at the beginning of the book, women are revered, they're respected, they're given honor. But by the time we get to the end of the book of Judges, we see, well, we aren't even giving this person a name. Manoah's wife is called Manoah's wife. Now, she's not really disrespected in other ways. It's not like she is degraded as an individual, but she's not given enough respect to actually have her name listed here. But the fact that she does not have kids is a disgrace to a woman in that particular time period, because that was one of the biggest things that a woman could do to have worth, was to bear sons for her husband. And so it was a difficult time for her and her family. But the angel comes to her and says that you will give birth to a son who will begin the deliverance of God's people. Again, this is the concept of begin. All the other judges had deliverance. There was deliverance that they were able to bring through their efforts, but Samson would only begin the deliverance. But remember, we have to keep in the back of our mind that God is meticulously spontaneous, not unpredictably chaotic. He has a plan. He knows what he's doing. We may not fully understand it, but God is in control. So Samson is a Nazirite. He will undergo the Nazirite vow from birth. And this concept of the Nazirite vow comes from Numbers chapter 6, in verses 1 through 21. It's kind of a long section where it talks about all the vow, but no alcoholic drink. You cannot cut your hair, and you cannot come in contact with a dead body. Those are the three main components of the Nazirite vow. And for the most part, anyone who would undergo the Nazirite vow would do so voluntarily for a specific length of time. And so it would almost be kind of like you're going to fast something for a while. There was a particular time frame that you would set, and you do it during this time frame. Well, the only people in the Bible that we know of that were Nazirites actually did it for their life. We have Samson here in the book of Judges. Samuel, we'll find, is a Nazirite. And then John the Baptist is also a Nazirite. And all three of them are Nazirites for life. So it's a little weird for us to say, well, it's normally this way, but the only examples we have are essentially for life. But one of the things about Samson is that he was a Nazirite, but this concept of Nazirite means to separate or to consecrate. So we've already said God is up to something. We see that when God is entering the story, we say, God is up to something, and there's something he is separating Samson from birth. He is putting him apart, so he is distinct, he is different, he is unique from the time he was born. But the theme of Samson's life, I think, is that he had a lot of unrealized potential. He broke all of those vows, and not just a whoops mistake. He made conscious decisions to sin and go against these vows that he had. How he lived was really just to fulfill his desires, which means he had a lot of unrealized potential. Now, Manoah's wife told Manoah, this was obviously happy news for her and for him. And Manoah's wife seems to trust the angel, but Manoah had some responses to this. In verse 8, Manoah prayed to the Lord, saying, "Lord, please let the man of God come back to us again and give us more instructions about this son who is to be born." God answered Manoah's prayer, and the angel of God appeared once again to his wife as she was sitting in her field. But her husband Manoah was not with her. So she quickly ran and told her husband, "The man who appeared to me the other day is here again." Manoah ran back with his wife and asked, "Are you the man who spoke to my wife the other day?" "Yes," he replied, "I am." So Manoah asked him, "When your words come true, what kind of rules should govern the boy's life and work?" The angel of the Lord replied, "Be sure your wife follows the instructions I gave her. She must not eat grapes or raisins, drink wine or any other alcoholic drink, or eat any forbidden food." So Manoah prayed for the angel of the Lord to return. And so he prayed with the assertion that he just wanted more instruction. He wanted greater clarity. We're not really sure what his motivations were and if we actually trust what he is saying there. On some level, I think there's at least a little bit of desire in Manoah's life. Well, I want to experience this myself. Sounded like my wife had a pretty cool experience. I don't want to miss out on that. He was jealous on some level. Now, Manoah in his prayer assumes that this promise that his wife shared with him will come true. But did he not really trust his wife? Did he think that she got something wrong? Was there some stereotypical concept going here where men didn't trust the women to follow instructions? Or what was happening? Why did Manoah need this? But the angel of the Lord returns. And part of what we see throughout the book of Judges is that He graciously accommodates his people. He comes to them time and time again, even though they don't deserve it. Even though there's nothing that should compel God to do it, God comes to his people. And we see that God's gracious accommodation to Manoah by coming to him again. And the angel reiterates his instructions. Essentially, what the angel says is, what your wife said, just do it. Trust it. You don't have to second guess it. What she's told you is accurate. There were a few other details that the angel told to Manoah, but in general, it's implied that there was nothing new. There was nothing new that the angel told Manoah that the angel had already told Manoah's wife. But Manoah gets this revelation, which shows that even though we don't deserve something, God oftentimes meets us with his grace. Then Manoah said to the angel of the Lord, "Please stay here until we can prepare a young goat for you to eat." "I will stay," the angel replied, "but I will not eat anything. However, you may prepare a burnt offering as a sacrifice to the Lord." Manoah didn't realize it was the angel of the Lord. Then Manoah asked the angel of the Lord, "What is your name? For when all this comes true, we want to honor you." "Why do you ask my name?" the angel of the Lord replied. "It is too wonderful for you to understand." Then Manoah took a young goat and a grain offering and offered it on a rock as a sacrifice to the Lord. And as Manoah and his wife watched, the Lord did an amazing thing. As the flames from the altar shot up toward the sky, the angel of the Lord descended in the fire. When Manoah and his wife saw this, they fell with their faces to the ground. The angel did not appear again to Manoah and his wife. Manoah finally realized it was the angel of the Lord. And he said to his wife, "We will certainly die, for we have seen God." But his wife said, "If the Lord were going to kill us, he wouldn't have accepted our burnt offering and grain offering. He wouldn't have appeared to us and told us this wonderful thing and done these miracles." So Manoah offers food, and the angel says, just make it an offering. Make it a sacrifice to the Lord. And part of what's happening here is Manoah is doing a cultural expectation of hospitality, of offering food to the stranger, to the visitor, to the guest. That is what he should do. But the angel redirects and says, let's give this to the Lord. But then he asks the angel, "What is your name?" It seems like a pretty just easy question. Nothing threatening about that. That would be something we would ask commonly in our culture. But in that culture, knowing the name of the other person would give you power and authority over them. Not in a way that you were the ruler over them, but it would show that you have something over them. So essentially what Manoah is doing when he's asking the angel of the Lord's name is he's trying to assert his dominance over this individual. But as the story unfolds, they have the sacrifice and the flames, and the angel ascends in the flames. It's Manoah and Manoah's wife realized that this was not just a regular encounter with a normal person. They had an encounter with God. It was a holy encounter. So he questions, are we going to die? It was that intense, that extreme of a situation. But Manoah's wife reminds him, first off, why would God waste all this effort just to kill us in this manner? But God accepted our offering. God is not going to kill us in this manner. Because remember, God is meticulously spontaneous. He's not unpredictably chaotic. God is not a loose cannon that we're like, ooh, is he just waiting up there to spite us? God is not waiting for you to mess up so that he can harm you. That is not what God is trying to do. He's got a plan. Sometimes he adjusts that plan to meet us with his grace, but God has a plan. As we think of Manoah's particular story here, we see a lot of similarities with Gideon's story in Judges chapter 6. When Gideon first meets the angel of the Lord, and the angel of the Lord gives Gideon instruction. And so we have this concept of Gideon offers a meal. Gideon asks for the name. Gideon makes a sacrifice. Gideon is scared that after the sacrifice and the angel of the Lord disappears, that he is going to die. Because Exodus chapter 33, verse 20, God is talking to Moses, and God says, "But you may not look directly at my face, for no one can see me and live." See, what's happening is that they have a very intense fear of God in this particular society. And I think that's something that we sometimes neglect, that we miss. Because the Jews had such a high fear of God that they don't even say the holiest name of God in the Old Testament. We say Yahweh. They don't even say it because they don't want to mispronounce it, which would be taking the Lord's name in vain. That's how healthy of a fear they have. Now, fear of the Lord is not, again, a fear that God is just waiting up there to smite us. It's an awe and a reverence that the Almighty God of the universe would even care about me. And recognizing that we are in His presence. So we have to make sure we have a healthy fear. But we also have to make sure that we don't assimilate to the culture. Because part of what Manoah was doing with this, with his hospitality measures, offering food, asking for the name, trying to assert his authority over the individual, were cultural practices that made the other person obligated to you. They gave you authority over that person. And when we interact with God, when we have these holy encounters, we have to make sure we recognize that it's just be a privilege to be part of it. We are not entitled to be part of what God is doing. There's nothing that says, God is forced to use me, but God chooses to invite me to participate in His plan. And there's a difference in our mentality with that. But the chapter ends when her son was born. Manoah's wife named him Samson, and the Lord blessed him as he grew up. And the Spirit of the Lord began to stir in him. So Manoah's wife gave birth to a son, and this is where we find out that the son is Samson. I've been alluding to that the whole time. But Samson, the name means bright, brightness, or sunny, which in a lot of ways would have brought brightness to Manoah's wife and to Manoah as they experienced this birth of their son. But remember, Samson has already set a birth. He was a Nazirite from birth. God had already set him apart, not for ordinary use, but for extraordinary use. God is doing something special. He is doing something different. He is up to something, but we may not know what it is. So when we say God is meticulously spontaneous, God is up to something, but it may surprise us. It's not going to surprise God. God can surprise us, but we can't surprise God. We can make God sad. We can make God happy. But nothing's gonna make God say, "Oh, I don't know how to handle this." See, God invites us to participate in His plan, and if we choose to reject that, like Samson did many times, God's going to find a way for His plan to come to fruition, whether we participate in it or not. But we see that God gave Samson everything he needed. So the Spirit of the Lord began to stir in Samson. God worked in Samson from his birth. And as he grew, the Spirit of the Lord began to stir in him. But as we look at Samson's life, and we'll spend the next 2 weeks looking at that, we'll find that Samson was a bit of a loner. He kind of did things by himself. One of the defining characteristics of most of the other judges is that they raised up an army or a group of people, and they led that group to defeat the enemy that was oppressing them. Samson always did things by himself. He didn't ask others to join him, didn't call for an army. He was a champion of Israel, and he led Israel for 20 years, but he never really led anybody. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 32 tells us that Samson was a man of faith. We also conclude that Samson was not faithful. He was not faithful to his parents. He was not faithful to the Nazirite vow. He was not faithful to his God. See, when God isn't permitted to rule in our life, God overrules and works out His will. Not in a way that He forces us to participate. But there's nothing that I can do to stop God's will from happening. See, when God has a plan, I can't put God in a position where he is beside himself but doesn't know what to do. And on some levels, that gives us confidence because we're imperfect. We're going to make mistakes. And when we make mistakes, we can know that God's got this under control. But we can also use this and recognize that if I'm a sinful individual who is rejecting God, God can still bring his plans to fruition. No matter where you are on that spectrum, God's plan is going to come. Now, there may be missed opportunities because of my failures. We talk in the church, our mission is to impact the world with the love and message of Jesus Christ. And I've said before that God has uniquely gifted and equipped you to have that impact. There may be people that you can impact that nobody else can. So if we don't participate in God's plan, there are real opportunities that are missed. There are real people that are impacted. So I'm not trying to say that you are superfluous to what's happening in this world, but that God has called us to participate in what he is doing. See, Samson embodies Israel as a sinful people who do things contrary to God. He breaks all the vows that he makes. He worships idols and participates in pagan activities. He assimilates to the culture around him and chases after things and desires that are contrary to God. And he has so much unrealized potential. But Samson also embodies the divine love of God that just can't let go. The book of Judges shows us God's long suffering. We are all imperfect. And I'm sure if you sat here for a moment, you could revel in all of your imperfections. But sometimes we try to be like Samson, strong on the outside. We show everybody that we got life put together, but yet we're broken on the inside. We're hurting on the inside. We're making all these mistakes, and it bothers us to no end. But we don't know how to get out. We don't know how to overcome. But I want to let you know today that God's love is not letting go of you. He is not rejecting you. He is not forsaking you. So even if we're like Samson and we make all these mistakes, as we'll get to in the next couple of weeks, God is never letting go of you. He is meticulously spontaneous, not unpredictably chaotic. He's not a loose cannon that we have to worry about harming us and smiting us. But he's got a plan, and he invites us to participate in it. And I believe in everybody's life, God is up to something. God was up to something when it came to Samson, when it came to Manoah and his wife. God is up to something if we willingly submit to him. See, as I said, Samson shows God's unrelentless love, how God seeks us. Samson also had some tenacious and at times irrational love. That's how much God loves you. So whatever you're going through today, wherever you are, whatever's on your mind, whatever problems you think you have, or whatever things you can't overcome yourself, I want to encourage you that God hasn't let go. But that doesn't mean we're done. God invites you to participate in what he's doing in this world. And what that means is we need to come to him and say, God, I need to be cleansed. I need to be refined. I need to be changed. I need to be transformed. I need to be made right with you. So God hasn't let go of you. No matter where you think you are, no matter how far away from God you may be, no matter how broken you are, God's holding on to you.